Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our 5th session of Letter Support for Pre-K Leaders. We are really excited to continue our series discussing literacy development and how it relates to 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in the state of North Carolina. As a reminder, each month we will host 2 opportunities for you to join us in this conversation. The sessions that occur within the same month will cover the same content. Today, we're going to try and make our content as interactive as we can. Cameron Amin, I am the early education consultant for the Piedmont Triad, and I'm here with a couple other consultants as well, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, my name is Holly Lee, and I'm an early education consultant, and I typically serve our North Central region of the state. Glad you're here.
And then in the background, we have the help and support of Jessica Fitzgerald and Jenny Wilkinson. Jessica is the early education consultant in the Northwest, and Jenny is in the North Central as well. So thank you guys for being here. So real quickly, we're going to go through our talking points for today. The first thing we're going to talk about are key reading models and comprehension. This will be a review. And then we're going to go through the importance of a read aloud, what that looks like in a repeated read aloud lesson plan, how we can support comprehension beyond that read aloud through activities in your classroom. And then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about connections to our North Carolina guiding documents. So we want to welcome you and kind of get you guys thinking with our welcoming and inclusion. So this is going to focus our attention and recall activities or instruction that's related to today's topic of comprehension. Our question is, when you think of the word comprehension as it relates to preschoolers, what comes to mind? We would love for you to drop that in the chat. When you think of the word comprehension, as it relates to preschoolers, what comes to mind?
Jenny, and I just wanted to share some of the things that were in the chat. One of our first ones is that children understand what you have said and what you've read to them.
Perfect. Making those connections.
Yeah. Someone else says answering the WH questions.
Perfect. And one of
the questions that related to the story.
I love it. And being able to support children in coming up with some of those WH questions is going to be a huge piece of that connection as well. All right, so we're going to jump into some review of some models. The first model, as we've reviewed in other sessions, this is the simple view of reading, or SVR, as it's often referred to. It is a formula introduced by Goff and Tumner in 1986. The SVR formula demonstrates reading comprehension is a product of decoding, so our word recognition and our language comprehension, which are separate and necessary skills. So when you're thinking about the simple view of reading, we want to make sure that we're helping students build a solid foundation in our phonological and phonemic awareness and beginning to make those connections in phonics. And then when we multiply that by our language comprehension, our oral language and our vocabulary and that understanding that you guys were just talking about, when we have a solid foundation of, if we're thinking about a math equation, we have a 1 in decoding and a 1 in language comprehension. 1 times 1 is going to be 1, equaling that reading comprehension or that strategic strong reader. If parts are missing in that equation, we're going to end up having some holes or some gaps. And so we want to make sure that weaknesses in either decoding or linguistic comprehension will reduce the ability for students to reach the ultimate goal of reading, which is comprehension. And you guys are serving as pre-K teachers as an integral part in building that foundation. The next model, if you have joined us in previous sessions, or you've started your reading or your journey in the science of reading, you're familiar with the model by Hollis Scarborough. It's Scarborough's reading rope. She developed this in 2001. Like the simple view of reading, Hollis Scarborough, her rope models the breakdown in the skills. So if you're thinking about that simple view of reading and you turn it on its side, that breakdown in reading skills into language comprehension and word recognition skills and what those pieces look like. When those skills are broken down, That word recognition side is going to be those phonological awareness skills, your decoding, and your sight recognition. And then today, when we jump into our topic of comprehension, we're going to look at that language comprehension side of the rope. We're going to think heavily about supporting language comprehension through the simple view of reading model and making sure that we are hitting each one of those strands within our classroom instruction. Our third model that you have seen quite often through our journey, this image depicts the essential components of literacy instruction. During our previous sessions, we've addressed print-rich environments that foster literacy. In the following sessions, we've covered components around oral language. That's our speaking and listening, and our oral comprehension lives strongly there. Then we've talked about vocabulary, phonological awareness, and phonemic awareness, and also we've talked about phonics and fluency. So today we're going to focus in that top blue corner around comprehension and building skills within the pre-K classrooms. And so I also want to remind you, don't panic. We are not asking you to teach your children to read in pre-K. But if we take you back to our letters for early childhood educators, as stated on page 1, early literacy is not about learning to read in preschool. It's about building the important foundation needed for a smooth transition into early reading and writing in the primary grades. So I want to take a second to pause and let you read this quote from Lucy Hart Paulson and Louisa Moats, and it comes directly from page 27 of our Letters for Early Childhood Educators manuals. And I want you to just kind of reflect for just a second. So it states, written language at every level goes through the oral language system. Developing a solid foundation in oral language is essential for learning to read and write. And so this quote really speaks to the need to provide children with ample opportunities to engage in conversation with adults and peers. Our children need to be able to hear stories read aloud to them and also have time to discuss. So like somebody said earlier with those WH questions, having time to answer questions, but also generate and talk about those questions with their peers about what they've heard or learned. So through composition, as do all essential components of literacy instruction, it begins with that oral language system. So what is comprehension? We asked you guys to share some words that came to mind when we thought about comprehension in our inclusion activity. And we've listed some ideas we've had with the processing systems, whereas other of you might have submitted some ideas to do with outcome or product. So when we're thinking about product, we're thinking about processes versus, when we're thinking about comprehension, we're thinking about processes versus product. And so prior to cognitive science advancements in the 1970s, comprehension was also often considered a tell and test activity. And so we as the teacher told our children stuff. Our students either listened to a text being read aloud, and then we gave them a test. What did they hear? What did they understand? We tested them on that. But what we have learned is that comprehension is not a product of the activity of reading. What we know now is comprehension is actually a process, and it's that process that's happening in our brain. What is happening in our thinking? We want to make sure that we're being able to identify when we're not understanding something that we're hearing or we're reading, and so we have that ability to stop and think and process through that and go back to try and understand. It's the process of being able to infer that is creating understanding from information that's not explicitly stated. It's creating a mental model of what we're reading or what's being read to us. And so as the teacher, it's us stopping and modeling what visualization looks like. What does it sound like in my brain when I'm thinking about these things? And being able to help support students in that thinking process. And it's also combining what we're reading or hearing with our personal knowledge and experiences. So today we really want to focus on supporting that comprehension as an ongoing process. And through that process of comprehension, students are going to combine what they're hearing or reading with what they already know in their minds, such as background knowledge, current understanding, and past experiences.
Thanks, Kim. So, read alouds provide a valuable avenue in helping children explore and immerse themselves in that rich academic language and experiences. So, as you might remember from our session 2 webinar, academic language is that language of school. It's defined as the language of learning with rich vocabulary that may be more abstract than what we typically use in our social everyday language. And so experiences with read alouds are helping children build that bridge from language comprehension to text comprehension. And purposely planned read alouds include opportunities for explicit vocabulary instruction, places to stop and ask children questions, and times for kids to generate their own questions, and really just opportunities and chances for children to engage in discussion with both adults and their peers. So on this slide, you will see the language comprehension portion of Scarborough's reading rope that Cam referred to earlier. And you'll see each of those strands. So we're going to have an activity here where we're going to invite you to select one of the strands of the language comprehension rope that you see on the screen now. In the chat, we want you to share your thoughts on how an interactive read aloud experience, could support that specific strand. So for example, if I selected vocabulary, I know that when children are engaged in an interactive read aloud, that they're going to gain knowledge of new and unique words. So we invite you to engage in this activity, pick a strand, and then talk about how read aloud could support that strand.
Brenda said with literacy knowledge, drawing or pre-writing activities that can support that read aloud.
Yeah, that's a really great way to help access children's background knowledge before you start reading. If a read aloud is on a specific topic, any kinds of activities or engagement that we can do that will be around that topic helps them start connecting and building into that background knowledge and bringing that context into that experience. Thank you.
Wendy also offers something along the line of literacy knowledge and saying that understanding how books work and should be treated or manipulated.
Yes, that's wonderful. So just from the experience of seeing a teacher handle the book and understanding the way that we orient it and the way we turn pages all connects into that strand of literacy knowledge. All right, thank you for your sharing and engagement. So children can listen on a higher level language than they can speak or read. So reading aloud makes complex ideas more accessible and exposes children to vocabulary and language patterns that are not part of their everyday speech. So through read alouds, preschool teachers can support every strand of the language comprehension side of Scarborough's rope. Children build background knowledge, grow their vocabularies, they become more familiar with various language structures, they hone those verbal reasoning skills and grow their literacy knowledge as they engage with a wide array of texts. And so now we'll hop into the repeated read aloud plan. So current research tells us that or supports the use of 3 reads of the same book over a short period of time as an effective practice. So the use of those repeated readings of that same book during a read aloud supports the ability for children to kind of focus on those specific skills. So we know that when we're engaging in repeated read alouds, that the burden of following a new book while also having to work on that specific skill is removed. When we can keep that text the same, it allows more cognitive capacity to be focused into that skill. So these repeated readings help build students' comprehension, background knowledge, and the ability to retell stories in their own words. So while it is wonderful to pick up those favorite books off the shelf to read when there's a spare moment in the day, it is really important that teachers are also providing quality read aloud experiences that are really well thought out and planned planned for based on the needs of their students. So prior to the first read, teachers should plan the purpose for reading the book. They should select vocabulary to explicitly teach and determine key times to discuss certain topics with children as the book is being read. So teachers begin planning for read alouds by determining what learning outcomes they are wishing for their students to acquire. And then based on those learning outcomes, teachers can select from a wide array of text genres as the basis for their read alouds. It's important that young children gain experience with each of these types of text. So here's the various ones or types of books that would be appropriate for preschool. We have narratives. And so these are the books that we are all probably most familiar with. They include characters, a setting, a problem solution. Our expository or informational books focus on factual information. We refer to these as nonfiction. Predictable text or pattern books can be used to provide experiences with alliteration and rhyme and support engagement as children have that opportunity to become the reader with repeated lines and cumulative text. Our concept books are those that are focused on skills or concepts that they're going to use to build their understanding of the world around them. And we can think about concepts as when we think about letter books, number books, those that are about colors or shapes. Those are all examples of concept books. And then we have our combination text, which is just as they are stated. They merge various text types within a singular text. All right, so let's spend a moment and dig a little deeper into expository or informational text. Even in the early preschool years, it's important to ensure that children have regular access to informational or nonfiction text. And what we know is that informational texts provide opportunities for children to dig deeper and learn more about their own interest. Those realistic photos that we find in nonfiction text also tend to elicit more questions from children about the topic at hand. We know that informational texts help build background knowledge of the natural world and the social one. So having background knowledge kind of provides us with that cognitive glue or Velcro to attach new learning to. And we know that informational texts provide wonderful opportunities for children to learn new and interesting language and to gain experience with higher order thinking. And so informational books we know they have those interesting print features. They have bold words, labels, indexes, and table of contents that are not always found in our other text genres. And we also know that for some children who may otherwise not be interested in books, informational text may actually be a preferred genre for them. So really just finding ways to make books more appealing to children who are uninterested is important for reducing the gap that can occur in early reading between children who enjoy books and those who do not. If we're going to have a book that we're going to read multiple times to children, we want to make sure that it is worthy and engaging and suitable for that purpose. So as teachers consider the purpose that they have for reading a specific book, there's other characteristics that they're going to want to keep in mind. And so we want to know, does that book offer an opportunity for new learning? Is it of high interest to our students? Is it something they're going to want to listen to more than once? Does it engage students in rich and complex vocabulary and sentence structure? We're going to talk about vocabulary in just a moment, but we wanted to have exposure to some of that academic language. Does the book provide opportunities to build background knowledge? Is there a diverse population or character set in the book? Are we representing everyone? Are the illustrations appropriate and big enough for children to see during the read aloud? And is there opportunity to pair a narrative text with supportive informational text or vice versa? So, for example, if we're going to read the story of the three bears as the narrative, is there an opportunity to pair that with an informational text about bears to learn about the facts and real life bears? And so, as we think about before that first read, we've talked about it's important for us to pick a worthy book for a read aloud, and to also think about what purpose or what outcomes we want our students to have. That's part of our planning before we read. But also, we need to begin selecting vocabulary to teach. And so, read alouds are that prime time to teach vocabulary. Children have to understand the words that are being read to them in order to comprehend the text. So as teachers are strategically selecting the type of text they will read, they should also preview the text to determine which vocabulary words will need to be explicitly taught to students. So teachers are going to want to select words that children are unlikely to know, and they're going to want to limit those selected words for instruction to 3 to 5 tier 2 words. So tier 2 words can be defined as those words that are necessary for comprehending the text and are words that can be applied in many other contexts, experiences, and discussions. So those words, they're the words that children will run into again. And Letters refers to these as high utility words. And so to better help
Right,
us
y'all. Thank you
discern,
so much for joining us this
tier
afternoon
1
for our
words
fifth
are the
session of letter
most
support for
basic
pre-K
common
readers.
vocabulary
We
that
are really
children
excited
learn
to continue
early.
our series
These words
discussing
are more
literacy development
concrete in
and
nature
how
and
it
relate
relates
to
to
the
3, 4, and
experiences and
5-year-olds in the
content
state of
that are
North Carolina.
familiar to children.
As a
And
reminder,
keep
each
in
month
mind
we
that
will
tier
host
1
2
words for
opportunities for
some
you to
groups of
join us in
children
this
will be
conversation.
tier
The
2
sessions that
words
occur
for other
within the
groups
same
of
month
children.
will cover
We
the
have to
same
consider their
content.
background knowledge,
Today
their
we're going
life
to try and make our
experience, their
content
home
as
vocabularies,
interactive as we
and their
can.
native language.
And we encourage you to please join us
Tier
through
3 words are
participation in the
those that
chat. This
occur
is a really small group with us
infrequently,
today, so
are
we'll have a
likely
lot
to
of
be found in
opportunities to be able to
texts
talk
about
with you
specific
guys.
topics, and they
I
can
am
be
Cameron Amin.
instructed
I
briefly
am
on the
the
spot
early education
so that
consultant for the
children gain
Piedmont
that
Triad, and I'm
understanding and
here
then they
with a
can
couple
keep
other
going.
consultants as well, and I'll
And
let
again,
them
those
introduce
tier 2
themselves.
words are those high utility
Hey
words
everyone, my name
that
is
may be
Holly
more
Lee, and I'm
abstract,
an early
have
education
multiple
consultant, and
meanings,
I
and that are
typically
more
serve our North
common in
Central region of the
print
state.
than in
Glad you're
speech.
here.
So if it is a struggle to find multiple tier 2
And then in the
words within
background,
the
we have the help
text,
and
consider
support
the
of Jessica
purpose in reading the
Fitzgerald and
book.
Jenny Wilkinson.
While the
Jessica
purpose
is
may
the
not
early
be to teach
education consultant
vocabulary, it is
in
still
the
important to
Northwest,
highlight
and
less
Jenny is
familiar
in the North
words to
Central
build
as well.
background
So thank you
knowledge
guys
within
for
the read
being
aloud.
here.
So by focusing on tier 2 words in preschool, children's vocabulary is enriched, so
So
comprehension
real quickly, we're going to
increases
go through our
throughout their
talking
journey
points
to
for
skilled
today.
reading.
The first thing we're going to talk about are our key reading. Thanks, Holly. All right, so we are going to talk about a little more about what planning for the first read looks like. In planning for that read aloud, teachers need to identify difficult language or concepts that are presented in the book and plan how they're going to address those with those students. And so this also goes back to what Holly was saying. Depending on your children and your needs of your children, it may look different as to what difficult concepts or vocabulary or language structure may look like in your book versus what it looks like in the classroom teacher next to you's classroom. And so it's really, really important that we're stopping and we're pre-planning. We recommend using sticky notes at these junctures to help teachers remember when to stop to talk about a vocabulary word or a phrase that might be difficult, or to stop and ask a question and provide clarification for your children within that instruction. And that way we're making sure that we support the comprehension and the correct comprehension of the content that's being presented. So now that we've previewed our book and we've planned for our read aloud, let's talk about what the repeated reading plans suggest as described in Letters for Early Childhood Educators. We want to discuss what we'll do before, during, and after each of these 3 reads. So during this first read, the teachers are going to set the stage for prior reading. The teacher is going to strive to read the entire book with only a few interruptions in order for students to really gain a sense of what the story and the characters are all about. Teachers want to keep the flow going. They should stop and model thinking aloud at those critical junctures where they've already pre-planned and they know that there might be some confusing content or that some questions were going to come up. And when that happens, they're going to pause and provide brief child-friendly definitions of those targeted vocabulary words or those questions that might be asked. And then after the first read, teachers are going to help guide students back to the big question that centers around the purpose of reading that book. Miss Mary, she's a preschool teacher, and she's going to introduce All right, so we want you to think about that first read aloud lesson plan. And how did Miss Mary plan for this read aloud? And Laura, I love what you say right here about thinking aloud. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But right now, how has Miss Mary planned for this read aloud? Yeah, Karen, she's tagged those vocabulary words so that she can introduce those. We can see those sticky notes as she goes through. She probably also has some engagement questions listed there as well. What elements of the first reading plan did you notice that Miss Mary demonstrated? So our second question, what elements of the first reading plan did you notice? And Laura, that's where we'll come back to that. She said, thinking aloud with I wonder questions. She provided some background knowledge of owls and descriptions of the illustrations. I so agree there that those descriptions of those illustrations really help build that background knowledge as they go through the story. Brenda says tone was engaging.
And Cam, I saw someone as they passed through, I don't have the chat pulled up, but they did catch that hook question that she had at the beginning, and the children were familiar with it. They said, let's read to find out. So
Perfect. Yeah, I heard that too. I thought that was really good. Perfect, perfect. Thank you guys. So we can tell that Miss Mary really has previewed and made plans for reading this book to her students.
Are going to.
She has, like you guys said, she has those post-it notes and she seems very strategic about what she's including for clarification. And she's already thought through those difficult topics that she's really supporting with describing those illustrations. We know that she, through how she stopped and questioned, that she's selected the word nocturnal as a targeted tier 2 vocabulary word. And she makes sure that she stops and she provides that child-friendly definition as she reads. And then just like someone in the chat and Holly said, she does a really good job of including that hook question to get children engaged, and they knew what that question was. So then either the next day or a couple days later, you're going to get into the second reading plan. And so as the text is read for a second time, the focus is now going to shift from getting the general gist to a more direct approach to help students further develop their understanding of the story and that targeted vocabulary word. Or vocabulary words. The teacher is going to allow more dialogue and discussion with the students to enhance their comprehension all along the way. So really thinking about those WH questions and any prepared questions she may have to provide opportunity for conversation. The teacher is going to ask those leading questions to the students and connect back to that first read, and will re-highlight the purpose for reading that text. So bringing it back to that hook question. And then during that read, the teacher is going to pause more frequently to clarify difficult concepts through discussion and questioning. She's going to pause to explicitly teach those targeted vocabulary words. And she's also going to invite the children to ask their own questions, again, facilitating opportunities for conversation around the text. And then once again, after the read, the teacher is going to make that connection to those big questions that they would answer through reading the text. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a deeper look at strategies that the teacher might use during the second reading. So as we mentioned in our before the first read section, we spoke about how teachers should prepare to address difficult concepts or language that's in the text. We want to make sure that we're purposeful and pre-planned with our questioning, and that's one way that we can really help our students clarify their understanding. So when we're looking at this chart, the first piece on the left is our literal questions. These are questions that are very concrete. There's no room for interpretation. They're factual in nature, and the answers can be drawn immediately from the text. They're those right there questions. Then we're going to move into the other end of the chart, and those are going to be our inferential questions. These questions that are more abstract, in which the meaning can be derived from the text in addition to background knowledge and experience that the child brings to the text. These answers can come from information we gather as we quote, you've probably heard, read between the lines. So it's not right there. We've got to do some thinking. We've got to do some clarifying and also make connections with what we know. The bottom arrow follows that same continuum. It's a back and forth. And we look at, on the far left, our contextual questions. These are questions in which answers come, again, directly from the text and are related to the here and the now. Questions and answers relate to people, objects, and actions in that immediate text. What is happening right now? As they move through that continuum, we move into decontextual questions. These are questions that are inferential and they're more abstract in their answers. The answers require children to think about what has happened or could happen in the text. So we're thinking about historical context and also future context, and more through those predictions. And the answers are not right there in the here and now in the text. It requires students to draw on answers and make connections to other experiences. And so research also tells us that when we're using questioning with young children, we should begin with a literal or contextual type of question. as their understanding at this level is required before they can answer the more inferential and decontextual type questions. This is a great opportunity for differentiation in your classrooms, and teachers should really consider which children should be asked literal right there questions that they need that text and picture support to be able to answer, and which children have moved on and can be asked some inferential questions and be able to ask, how do I know? And why do we know this is happening? Where they're having to draw on those experiences and read in between the lines. These questions can frequently be answered through quality formative assessment practices that are occurring within your classroom. So we're going to do a little bit of engagement. We're going to give this a try. On the screen, you see an excerpt from The Tale of Peter Rabbit. I'm going to pause for just a second for you to read it, and then I will read it aloud. Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" So what we want you to do is, what contextual or literal question might you ask the student first? And remember, contextual questions are about the events immediately occurring within the text, and literal questions are concrete and more factual in nature. Perfect. So keep your contextual question in mind. Now we want to invite you to think of a more decontextual or inferential question that you might ask next. And this might be something that is paired with your literal question. So when we're thinking through differentiation, we've got the students that need that literal, but we're going to draw off of that literal question through an inferential question. So if you'll drop your decontextual or inferential questions in the chat, we are going to click through and reveal some of the examples that we came up with and that are really similar to yours as well. What was Mr. McGregor doing when he saw Peter? And then the decontextual, why did Mr. McGregor chase Peter out of the garden? Perfect. It plays off of what he was doing and why he wanted Peter not to be there. And then another contextual or literal, what did Mr. McGregor yell at Peter? And it's decontextual or inferential pair. What might happen to Peter if Mr. McGregor catches him? So we know that Mr. McGregor is mad, and what might happen. So when you're thinking through the planning of these differentiated questions, really consider that shift from contextual to decontextual in the context, as you know, like as you understand your students. So when we're thinking about questioning, good questioning requires planning ahead, consideration for purpose and levels of questioning, ample opportunities to discuss answers with peers. So again, providing that opportunity for discussion. It's not just a teacher asks a question, children provide an answer. And then also, again, that ample opportunities for children to generate their own questions and discuss with their peers. So during the second read, teachers are going to want to stop and spend more strategic time teaching the selected vocabulary words. Letters for Early Childhood Educators provides teachers with an explicit vocabulary teaching routine, and you can find that on page 78 of your manual, and we've also included it here on the slide. Many words in English have multiple meanings, and we want children to have a clear understanding of those word meanings. When we stop to teach what a word means, it's also a great time to highlight or point out these differences. So I'm going to drop in the chat a YouTube link that you guys can copy. We're not going to watch it right now, but it's a great resource for you. And it's just more detailed information about vocabulary instruction that was provided in session 2 of our series. So if you want to go back, that is the recording from session 2 around vocabulary, and you can watch it again. So now we're moving to the third read of the story. It helps move ownership of the experience from the teacher to the student. Teachers can initiate with some recall questions, helping students remember the voice and voice the title, characters, setting, and generally what's happening in the story. So it's going to be a really brief overview for that first part. And then while they're reading, questioning is going to shift to more inferential and decontextual types of questions. This is going to allow students to make those connections to previous experiences or those outside of school settings. This in the third read, it's also going to be time for students to be able to share what targeted vocabulary words mean. as they occur in the book. And then the teacher is also going to want to take time to pause and have them share with a shoulder buddy a new sentence about the vocabulary word. And this is also going to be time where when you have your students wanting to share those connections and wanting to ask more personal questions, this is going to be that time in that third read for that to come out. This is also a great time to revisit that big question relating back to the purpose of the story, but also to discuss the sequence of events and have students have the opportunity to reenact and sequence the events. And again, drawing back those personal connections. So just as another review, in session 2 of our pre-K webinar series, we discussed oral language stimulation strategies that you can see here on the screen. And these support children's repetitive and expressive language development. So as we're thinking through the third read, when students are taking more ownership of that experience, this is a great time to revisit some of these strategies. And as children ask and answer questions, teachers have the opportunity to tune in. They can encourage additional exchanges and recast or expand on students' language to make connections to any inaccuracies and provide that corrective support. And it's also a great opportunity to naturally include repetition of key vocabulary words within the context of organic conversation. So we're going to watch Miss Mary again, and this is going to be a model of the third read. This time she's concluding the read, and so as you watch, drop in the chat a few ideas about what you notice. And I'm going to drop in the bit.ly just in case you need it or want to have it later. All right, so in the chat, how did student involvement change by the end of the third read? All right, so we have students recalling phrases from the story. Yeah, like familiar. And they were explaining the book to you. Perfect. Miss Mary allowed a lot more time for dialogue between the students. Susanna says they understood more about the book and were able to relate to the story. Like the little boy talking about how he missed her. Perfect. And how did Miss Mary revisit the big question at the end of the story? All right. So she poses that question at the end of the story that supports that enduring understanding, right? And she says, "For those we love, we are sad when they go away, even though we know they will return." So she comes back to that big picture and that big question that we started with in our first read. I'm going to turn it back over to Holly.
Thanks, Kim. Let me get everything organized here. All right, so we've been through the repeated reading plan, and so we know that those read alouds are very critical and foundational structure to support children's comprehension. And we know that children need additional repetition with new concepts and language to help deepen that understanding and to solidify that new learning and to really support comprehension. And so when we think about those preschool classrooms, we know that their environmental structures are already present that create these natural spaces for children to practice those hidden thought processes that we talked about earlier that support comprehension. So we know that teachers can engineer their environments to keep the learning going well after the read aloud is over, and they can continue to support comprehension development in other contexts. So let's look at a few ideas. So here we talk about, providing those books and the props and the puppets or pictures for the children to reenact those familiar or recently read stories. We can talk about giving children the opportunities to become their own authors, where the teacher will serve as the scribe and they will write down the stories for the children. And then they can provide opportunities for peers to act out those stories. We can create opportunities for new vocabulary to come to life in children's play. So, for example, if the target vocabulary is around marine life, we can think about how we incorporate aquatic plants or animals into the Science and Discovery Center so that they're going to have naturalistic opportunity to practice that vocabulary. And then I think it's really important for comprehension when we think about that mental process. We have to be able to recognize when we don't understand something. We need to think about that from a language perspective too. So it's important for us to teach children that social skill of how to politely ask for clarification when they don't understand the language of others. It's reinforcing that process of I don't understand something and I need to do something about that. Video here of the day is this is from the Regional Education Laboratory Midwest, and it shows how to implement research-based literacy practices from the What Works Clearinghouse through play-based learning. And so in this video, a preschool teacher uses play-based learning to target reading comprehension. Alrighty, so we are going to finish up just looking at our connections to our guiding documents that we are aware of. We know that we have the literacy instructional standards. Just as a reminder, these are available for preschool, and they were a resource developed by our Office of Early Learning to specifically support pre-K teachers in the area of literacy. And they're written as practices for teachers to intentionally integrate that will be aligned with science of reading. And here we included a slide that kind of speaks to what the LIS, or the Literacy Instructional Standards, tell us about comprehension. And you're going to notice that they are all, each of these various strategies are grounded in read alouds. With foundations, our early learning in development standards, we know that there are specific LDC 9, language development and communication. We know that that is specifically connected to comprehension as well. And as a reminder, your foundations have lots of additional strategies and ideas that support each one of the areas and each of the goals found throughout. Our Head Start framework contains connections to comprehension as well. And one of the preschool literacy subdomains is comprehension and text structure. So you'll see that listed out specifically. And the progression here aligns to the information that we have in Letters for Early Childhood and in the North Carolina Foundations. And it really demonstrates that triangulation between multiple resources. And so today, as administrators or center directors, we want to kind of think just about some different activities that we can do as leaders in our buildings to continue to support comprehension development in supporting our staff in order to be able to support those skills with their students. And so we really want to talk about having materials available for language stimulation and retelling. We really want to support teachers with planning and being intentional in their selection of text to use with Read Aloud. We want to make sure that we have high quality text available to our classrooms that represent a wide array of genres, and especially that informational one. We don't want to overlook that for early childhood. And just reinforce that teaching and modeling of the thinking processes that occur during a read aloud. And just as a reminder, this is our Letters for Little Learners, Conversations and Classroom Connections. This is our PLC, or Community of Practice document that aligns with the Early Childhood Letters version. And earlier in today's session, we referenced information from Letters for Early Childhood, Unit 2, Oral Language Connections specifically. And so today, this is the remainder of our sessions for our webinar support series for our pre-K leaders. You'll see that we finished up our first option for session 5. There's 2 more available, and we hope to see you there in the coming months. And we will just close with our resources that we have available. These are on the NCDPI's website, and you can, as you continue to integrate your knowledge of foundational literacy skill development, there's lots here to help you on your way with your journey. And so we will close today and with words of thank you.